I think when I was hearing Rustam's talk in the morning, I realized that museums appear on our plates like broccoli, and they need to appear more like potatoes and onions. We know more recipes with them, and we can eat them better. So I hope with the various projects that are happening in the country, both in the private sector and in the government sector, we're able to make this shift of menu. So Chitra and I would like to thank the IFA for inviting us to tell our story. I'm happy that Abir is also present here. He was the co-curator of this project at the National Museum. And during the discussions, perhaps he can also give his inputs. I also have a disclaimer to give. I no longer work with the National Museum in the capacity of its head of outreach, but will be representing the institution's story, in this case as I was coordinating the project. Before I start, I have a small confession to make. My mother has recently undergone a heart surgery, and therefore, inevitably, my vocabulary has found itself suddenly enriched with medical terms. And I will generously use them. Please don't try it at home. I'm not a professional doctor. While representing the museum side of the story in this project, I must articulate the vision of the institution, which was developed through 2013 and 2015. And it was within this environment that we ushered in the IFA project. I will take the next few minutes to describe the development of this vision and focus on two particular strategies, which were the key ingredients in bringing back the museum into public eye. And I do see some ex-colleagues from the National Museum in the audience, and I do invite them to contribute later about this journey. But first, a flashback about how it happened. In 2013, the Ministry of Culture appointed a well-trained surgeon as the administrator and director general of the National Museum. This is normal practice. Forest officers, railway officers, postal officers, they often end up at the museum. As it were, in this case, it was not only the tradition upheld, it was actually desirable. Not just because he was familiar with his tools, you know who I'm talking about, Dr. Venu, who's not been able to make it today. He knew the anatomy of the creature that is called Indian culture and how it could be experienced by the public. The museum was suffering, unfortunately, from various ailments, infections, genetic disorders, addictions, posture issues, and several life-threatening conditions. Homeopathy and naturopathy were not working. Yoga had not been introduced. It's 2013, mind you. It urgently required serious interventive procedures and rehabilitation. Most of you were privy to these interventions, or rather part of it, so I won't bother going into the details. But Dr. Venu was about to moderate this session this morning, so I can happily say that the surgeon survived the surgery. From mid-2013 through 2014, several pacemakers were implanted, the setting up of the outreach department, appointment of half a dozen assistant curators, a very, very fresh breath of air in the museum, the introduction of a major milestone in the history of the museum, a volunteer guide program, which is still working as the best blood thinner, mind you. The museum still enjoys over 100 volunteers working over 25,000 people each year. More particularly, the strategies that should be mentioned in the context of curation, narratives, and a fresh approach to storytelling. In the case of National Museum, were organizing temporary exhibitions and collaborations. And I cannot underestimate the value of this strategy that was adopted over 5 years and what it brought into the museum. I would probably run through a few slides to just show you examples of how these strategies were put to implementation. Everybody remembers the Body in Indian Art show. It opened into early 2014. What it did was it brought back the Delhi visitor into the National Museum. But there was another thing. I've put Naman's picture in this slide particularly because I think he was also an exhibit. And I don't mean it in a bad way. I think the exhibition really came alive when he was taking his curatorial walks. And so we must not assume that the moment we put an exhibition up there, it's on its own and it can make everybody understand what it's about or encourage interactions. So constant moderation between the curator and the audience in the exhibits is not a bad idea. I mean, we don't have to follow a standard model. We also were able to allow completely private collections to come and show at the National Museum, and why not? I mean, if this is the National Museum, it should allow for everyone to exhibit their ideas and their objects. This was a collection of archival maps from Hyderabad that came and was a very big exhibition at the National Museum. I don't know if I can say this, but for the first time, an exhibition curated around a minority community in such glory was put together. The Everlasting Flame, the history of Zoroastrianism was opened in 2016. And I wish there were more such exhibitions which were celebrating the minority communities in such grand scale, and that doesn't happen in government museums so often. Of course, it gave us the opportunity to purchase a lot of infrastructural material for the museum, and surprisingly, this was funded by the Ministry of Minority Affairs, and we suddenly found that there was a grant called Hamari Dharohar, which the Ministry of Minority Affairs gives for organizing such exhibitions. The other thing I wanted to say about this show was that it also put back a sort of design language that the museum is kind of lacking in various permanent galleries. I'm not saying this is the standard design, but it was a very aesthetic experience, and people really enjoyed it. The other exhibition called Nauras, The Many Arts of Deccan, put at its center the idea of cosmopolitanism. It was organized in 2015, and at that time it was very important to bring back this narrative into main focus. So what I'm trying to say is that ideas and different narratives and stories were emerging through temporary exhibitions as opposed to the permanent collections. And perhaps we are reaching a stage where a large national museum or a large government museum should have fewer permanent displays and more temporary exhibitions to allow more ideas to circulate. There were a range of medium-scale exhibitions. This one called Cadence and Counterpoint was around the Barnums. There is a gallery on Northeast in the National Museum, and I think this was a great experiment where the distance between the tangible and the intangible was bridged very beautifully. And these were all sort of emerging as models that could impact the permanent galleries in the museum. About 90% of government museums in India start at a gallery on Harappa, but there are so many other archaeological excavations that are happening, and they must be represented in national museums. So Unearthing Patnam, that came from KCHR, from the site of Patnam, was again a very curious exhibition about the process of archaeology and its politics and how to interpret objects. For the first time, the National Museum held an exhibition called A Passionate Eye, which was to celebrate a private donation of objects to the museum. This must have been a great effort that C.L. Bharani chose to give away a large number of his objects to the museum in the 70s. And it was never celebrated as a standalone donation, and this exhibition gave us that opportunity. Every time a proposer would come and give us a project on photographs, it would go to the National Gallery of Modern Art. And that we thought was not necessary, because the National Museum could also lend itself, and its space and its intellectual resources to exhibits in photography and other 2D objects. We found ourselves collaborating more with Asian museums, and that was very encouraging because it brought in stories, struggles, and shared histories from closer parts of India. And eventually, it, I think, encouraged permanent curators in the museum to curate from their collections. It's very unfortunate, and not just in government museums, but also in private museums, that a curator has to wear various hats, and 80% of the time they're doing collection management or they're doing administrative work. Where is the time for them to do new research? But the moment you put an inspiration out there, I think it sort of pushes people to do something. And Dr. Anamika Pathak, who's the curator for the decorative arts, put together this exhibit on the art of calligraphy. These trends had already started affecting the way our permanent collections were curated. And for the first time in the history of the National Museum, a curator from outside of the museum curated a permanent gallery, which is Usha Balakrishnan worked on the collection of jewelry. We didn't let go of rhetoric. So even when Yoga Day was being celebrated, we made sure that some collections came out and some work happened around that. There are some galleries on the second floor which nobody visits because by the time one gets tired going there. So we started organizing special programs on the second floor to bring back focus on the collections from there. And then again, as a rare occurrence, we could get an object from the IGRMS in a one-object exhibition at the National Museum. And again, although there was a permanent Northeast gallery in the museum, this gallery brought in more audiences from the Northeast than the gallery itself. I mean, a large number of young students who are studying in Delhi University did come around and brought their friends in at this show. There are many government initiatives that are sort of lurking around and we don't take full advantage of them. The Delhi Metro Rail Corporation does allow its spaces to be used under their CSR. And they gave us about 7,000 square feet area to show images from the museum. And we used that opportunity to show our collections there as well. And of course, collections were rendered into products and other objects. I think Suchitra will talk about the project that happened at the National Museum. But I just wanted to give you a glimpse of the kind of warming up within which the IFA project was ushered in. It of course had its challenges, but it also gave us a great deal of opportunities to collaborate with people who were not necessarily permanent employees of the museum. And I hope that trend sort of continues because that's the only way we can go from broccoli to onions.